Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and it should be a very interesting and exciting, stimulating conversation with Dr. Gabrielle Walker, who I will be introducing shortly. We're here to discuss climate change, action, and sustainability with author and energy expert Dr. Gabrielle Walker, who I mentioned. And just before we do that, I think it's useful to frame the conversation that we're going to be having. And as in many parts of the globe, climate change in the Southwest is not a concern for the second half of this century or some far-off future. Climate change is here now, as the region enters what has been termed a drier climate state, not seen since medieval times. A new study on the Southwest by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, notes, quote, "The weather patterns that typically bring moisture to the southwestern United States are becoming more rare, an indication that the region is sliding into the drier climate state predicted by global models." In a separate scientific study, the chances of a 35-year or longer mega drought striking the Southwest and Central Great Plains by 2100 are above 80% if the world stays on its current trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. If countries are to reduce their emissions to current, what are termed middle-of-the-road targets, the chances of a mega drought hitting the Great Plains drop to 60 or 70%, but remain at 80% for this region. To quote from one early warning on how humans are behaving with respect to the biosphere, upon which we all depend, "The Earth is fast becoming an unfit home for its noblest inhabitant, and another era of equal human crime and human improvidence would reduce it to such a condition of impoverished productiveness, of shattered surface, of climatic excess, as to threaten the deprivation, barbarism, and perhaps even the extinction of the species." Those are the words of George Perkins Marsh, writing in his book Man and Nature in 1864, illustrating that environmental concerns, including of climate, extend back well over 100 years. Seeking to identify where such problems might have arisen, Mira Ben writes, quote, "The tragedy today is that educated and moneyed classes are altogether out of touch with the vital fundamentals of our existence, our Mother Earth, and the animal and vegetable population which she sustains. Thus, the world of nature's planning is ruthlessly plundered, despoiled, and disorganized by man whenever he gets a chance. By his science and machinery, he may get huge gains for a time, but ultimately will come desolation. We've got to study nature's balance and develop our lives within her laws if we are to survive as a physically healthy and morally decent species." Ben, who was a student of Gandhi, wrote those words almost 70 years ago, April 1949. Hence, it's vital that we recognize not only how long ordinary people, scientists, and activists have been struggling, theorizing, and analyzing about environmental degradation, but how that is inextricably linked with social degradation. To bring that story up to date, in 2010, it took 388 billionaires to have the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the Earth's human population. A mere 4 years later, it only took 88 billionaires to own more than 3.6 billion people. We're on track to further concentrate it to 62 by the end of this year. Even more astonishing is that according to accounting firm Credit Suisse's calculations, wealth generation has risen to record rates. Contrary to how the vast majority of humanity has experienced the last 15 years, wealth has more than doubled since 2000, reaching $263 trillion. A quote from that report, "For the calendar year 2013, we estimate that global wealth rose by $21.9 trillion. Even the equipment here is shocked. It's falling off its own stool. This is more than the amount gained in any other 12-month period since 2000, and it exceeds the total loss resulting from the financial crisis in 2007-8. On that basis, it seems likely that personal wealth has recently been rising at the fastest rate ever recorded. Of this vast quantity of money, almost all of it has gone to the very pinnacle of the extremely wealthy. The top 1% of the world's population own and control more than $130 trillion. As the report goes on to say, our estimates suggest that the lower half of the global population collectively own less than 1% of global wealth, while the richest 10% of adults own 87% of all wealth. The top 1% account for almost half of all assets in the world. And so it should surprise no one that the ever-growing and obscene levels of social deprivation, racism, and the chasm in inequality coincides with humans approaching a planetary abyss with respect to climate change. Accompanying that is a host of other interlinked crises: biodiversity loss as we enter the 6th great extinction, acidification of the oceans, chemical contamination of soil, air, and water, deforestation, overfishing, to name only a few. Indeed, it is impossible to separate our social crises from our ecological crises, because they are simply manifestations of the same systemic crisis faced by our society. Seeking to address climate change in isolation is as likely to be successful as tackling a forest fire with a single bucket. To discuss some of these interlocking issues of climate change, energy, and justice is Dr. Gabrielle Walker, an expert on climate change and the energy industry. She holds a PhD in natural sciences from Cambridge University and has taught at Cambridge and Princeton. She is the author of 4 books, most recently Antarctica, An Intimate Portrait of a Mysterious Continent, and the best-selling The Hot Topic, What Can We Do About Global Warming?, co-written with former Chief Scientific Advisor to British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Sir David King. Gabrielle has written and presented numerous programs for BBC Radio and television, and has written for a host of international newspapers and magazines. She is currently Chief Scientist at Zinteo, an advisory firm that works with corporations to enable business to grow in a manner which is responsive to the resource, climate, and demographic challenges of the 21st century. Gabrielle is a self-confessed ice addict, having made over a dozen trips to both poles. She has swum with piranhas, dived with David Attenborough on the Great Barrier Reef, hooked lava out of a live volcano, and flown in zero gravity. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Gabrielle Walker.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction, and thank you all of you for coming, and thanks especially to the Lannan Foundation. It's such a pleasure to be here in Santa Fe and to be talking to you tonight. So I am going to talk to you about some of the things that Chris has raised, and he's already set a tone for some of the conversation we're going to have. It's a difficult story, and it's a challenging one, and I'm going to, with your permission, take you on the journey that I've been on in understanding about climate change and trying to do something about it. And I have to warn you right here, right now, that it gets pretty bad before it starts getting better. There are some bad parts of this, but I'm not going to say that there's a happy ending to the story, because we're not at the end of the story yet, but there will be a much more positive ending by the time I'm done speaking tonight. So thanks for coming, and here we go. What we have here is, this is me, and this is a friend of mine who's an astronomer. Now, he has a slightly disagreeable habit of persuading me to get out of my nice warm bed at ridiculous hours of the morning and go out and meet him and see celestial wonders. Luckily, the celestial wonders he shows me tend to be pretty gorgeous, so that's why we're still friends. And this particular celestial wonder that he was showing me was the planet Venus. And I put it in here today because the planet Venus is quite an extraordinary one, and was part of my understanding about the situation that we're here in now on Earth. And I'll come back to space at the end, but let me just say something at first about the planet Earth and the planet Venus. So this is Earth, beautiful planet. I have a friend who's a planetologist, and I said to him, he studies Mars, he studies Venus, he studies Mercury, he studies Jupiter and Saturn. I said, what's your favorite planet of all the ones you study? And he said, Earth. He said Earth. So this is Earth, and this is Venus. They're about the same size. They're actually sister planets. Venus is a little bit closer to the sun, the Earth a little bit further away from the sun. The Earth is this beautiful blue planet covered in oceans. Venus is a hellhole. In spite of it being the goddess of love, or perhaps it's appropriate that it is the goddess of love. But that's another story. The surface of Venus is so hot that it would melt lead. It has intense acid rain falling. It's covered in clouds. The reason it looks so bright in the sky is that it's completely swathed in clouds. You have to use special instruments to penetrate through the clouds and see the surface beneath, like that. So why would that be? Venus is closer to the sun, but not that much. It's about the same size. It has a similar history to the Earth. There's one important difference between Venus and the Earth, and that's that Venus has in its atmosphere very large amounts of greenhouse gases. The Earth has smaller amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we're in the process of changing that. I'll bring you back to that in a moment. Okay, so this is a little bit of my journey. That's me there. This is me in my previous incarnation. First of all, I was a scientist, and then I was a teacher in universities, and then a researcher, and then I started being a writer. And I went around the world finding interesting things, understanding or trying to understand how the Earth works, how it all fits together. So I'm in Namibia here, and I was there to write my first book, which is about an amazing climate event that happened 600 million years ago. And as I was researching for this book, I discovered how intimately everything on the Earth fits together. You have to understand not just the rocks, not just the oceans, not just the ice, not just the atmosphere, not just the biology, not just the chemistry, not just the physics. You have to understand everything, how it all fits together. And if you don't understand all of it, you don't really understand any of it. And I was quite thrilled by that because at school, the US is much more enlightened than the UK, where I grew up, the United Kingdom. Everyone was always telling me I had to specialize, I had to specialize, I had to specialize. But what I've learned, and what I learned in my previous incarnation as a writer, writing about different ways about how the Earth works, is that actually it's where things fit together and where things connect that the most important things happen. So in the process of this, I then went on to my favorite place in the world, Antarctica. And as you heard, I wrote a book about it, and it really is an extraordinary place. And it is a place where you learn more than anything how all the different parts fit together. It's also a place that looks out into space. This is actually the South Pole. And the South Pole is full of the most amazing telescopes, and they have this unique window. It's a very special place because you can see things into space from Antarctica that you can't see anywhere else in the world. So the scientists there have managed to figure out some of the things that we now know about our place in the universe. And I'll come back to that as well. But the reason I wanted to talk about Antarctica now, apart from the fact it's a little bit of an obsession of mine, is this. This is me again. And it's like when you're standing there at the South Pole, it really feels like you're on the moon. There's nothing and nobody. There's no life, there's nothing. It's actually quite thrilling. I do like people, really, I do. What I'm standing on here is even more astonishing, because what I'm standing on is actually a mountain of ice. It's a mountain of ice. That ice is miles, it's about 2.5 miles thick. And the ice has been accumulating on Antarctica for hundreds of thousands, for millions of years. So right in the center, it's a bit like being here in Santa Fe. You get altitude sickness, and you get kind of dizzy, and you don't really know what's happening. But this mountain of ice has something very special to tell us. Because when it was forming, the snow was falling, and more snow fell on top, and more snow fell on top over hundreds of thousands of years. And that squeezed it and turned it into ice. And it turns out that you can drill down into that. You can drill down into it, and when you're drilling down into it, it's almost like being in a time machine. You're looking further and further back, the deeper you go, to the older and older ice. And this is the oldest ice that's ever been recovered from Antarctica. It was 3,200 meters down. And the reason that that's so important is that Antarctica is like a library or a history book or something. It's trapped the history of our climate in that ice. And if you drill down into it, you can actually understand what we've been doing to our climate. So that's what an ice core driller looks like. That's what the ice core looks like. And the ice is full of bubbles. The ice is full of pieces of air that were trapped hundreds of thousands of years ago and have never escaped since. So these particular pieces of air were trapped before humans were even invented. They were trapped 800,000 years ago. I was lucky enough to be there in Antarctica while they were finishing the drilling, and they brought up that last piece. It was a joint French and Italian base, and so they had fantastic food. And they also did a big party. They had massive bottles of champagne, and they gave us all champagne, and they put little shavings from the oldest ice in the champagne, and you could hear the popping of the bubbles that have never been breathed by humans before. That's how we celebrated. I have to say, tasted a bit of drilling fluid, to be honest. But it was very nice of them, and it was nice to join the celebration. But there's a very serious point here, really. Because I did breathe that air, and the air that was 800,000 years old, and then there's air that's a little bit younger and a little bit younger and a little bit younger, all the way up to the present day. You can trace the history of our air. Pieces of air, real pieces of air. This isn't some kind of construct or model. This is pieces of the atmosphere that show how our atmosphere has been changing. And what it shows is that sometimes it gets a bit warmer, there's a bit more greenhouse gases in the air, sometimes it gets a bit colder and there's fewer greenhouse gases in the air, sometimes it gets a bit warmer, all perfectly naturally. And then in the last 150 years or so, the levels of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have skyrocketed. There's very considerably more of them in the atmosphere now than there have been for at least 800,000 years, and we know that from Antarctica. So I'll just remind you again of the Earth and Venus. The difference between them, Venus has a lot of greenhouse gases, the Earth doesn't have so many, and that's the direction we're going in. You know, it's something that once you've seen, it's hard to unsee. And once you've learned, it's hard to unlearn. Before this point, I used to go around the world, you know, swimming with piranhas and flying in zero gravity and writing about it and having a fine old time. But when you realize that something as serious as this is happening, when you breathe the air, when you take it in and you understand the science is real, and this is how you know, then it's very hard not to get scared about it. So what we're doing is we're burning coal, oil, natural gas, we're burning forests, and the way that we do our agriculture, all of them together are contributing to this massive increase in the amount of greenhouse gases. And we know that greenhouse gases make things warmer. And so the next question is, what happens next? If we keep on doing this, what happens? And this is where it feels like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse come in, but there's more than 4. So heat waves. Very dramatic increase in heat waves. This is something that Chris already mentioned. Forest fires. Intense hurricanes. What happens when you put so much extra energy in the atmosphere, it's not just that things get warmer, it's that things get more energetic. The atmosphere can soak up more water from the oceans. And when it does that, it has much more energy, and the storms become vastly more intense. Melting glaciers. Flooding. Flooding partly because of that intensity in the atmosphere and the increased storms, partly because of the melting glaciers, and because the sea is actually expanding as it warms, and therefore sea levels rising, and you add that together with the intense storms, and you get much more flooding. Spread of disease. This lovely lady, I know it's a lady, because it's only the female mosquitoes that actually bite. As we get more and more global warming, the predictions are that we'll get a very dramatic increase in the spread of mosquitoes and the spread of mosquito-borne diseases and other related diseases too. And food. One of the consequences of global warming is not just that you get an increase in the temperature, it's also that you get reduction in the amount of water available when you're trying to do agriculture, which means that already there are parts of the tropics where the capacity to grow food is decreasing, and remember that the human population is rising. Corals. You heard that I dived on the Great Barrier Reef with David Attenborough, and if you like corals, really go soon. Because it's not just that the water's warming, it's also that it's getting more acid as it dissolves carbon dioxide. And the corals are bleaching. And when I was there at the Great Barrier Reef, I was talking to scientists there who said, by the middle of the century, the Great Barrier Reef will be a bunch of rocks covered in slime. I promised not to put any graphs on this when I said I was going to do a presentation, but I just wanted to put this one up. because I want you to see just these different temperatures that are up here. Basically, what it's saying is, as you get warmer and warmer above what the planet was used to when we first came along, things get worse. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, and 5 degrees. And gradually, with the extreme weather events, the loss of water, the food, the ecosystem changes, all of that gets considerably worse. We'll come back to this number, 1.5 and 2. Somewhere around here is where scientists say, and where politicians have eventually agreed that we need to try and keep the temperature. But there's a couple of things that give me nightmares on top of the things that I've just told you, and I promise you it does get better. The story does get better, but it's going to get worse first. Because these are the wild cards that all of those predictions, and very accurate predictions that scientists are trying to make with their models and with their understanding of the Earth, have no idea what's going to happen. This is Greenland, the Greenland ice sheet. The Greenland ice sheet is melting. If the whole thing melted, it would put about 7 meters of sea level rise. Think about that. Every square inch of ocean everywhere in the world, the entire Pacific, the entire Indian Ocean, the entire Atlantic, the entire Arctic Ocean, every bit of it rising by 7 meters. That's what, 21 feet, if it melted. Now, we don't know when it's going to melt, because the models can't handle it. This is Antarctica, my favorite continent. The eastern side of Antarctica is probably pretty safe. It's very, very solid. The western side is already melting. And if that went, that would be another 5 meters. That's another 15 feet or so. Every square inch of ocean. And this is the one that scares me most. They call these drunken trees because the trees have kind of lurched over. This is the permafrost, the permanently frozen soil that goes right across the northern parts of Russia, northern parts of Canada, and it's where the soil is permanently frozen. And within it, it's got leaves and twigs and branches and other kinds of carbon soils, and they just stay there. It's like you put stuff in your freezer, and then it just stays. But if you turn the freezer off, what happens? It starts to rot. And that's what's happening here. The permafrost is starting to melt. The stuff inside it is starting to rot. It's giving out methane, which is one of the most serious of the greenhouse gases, which means it's getting warmer, which means you melt more, which means you rot more, which means you get warmer, which means you melt more, and it runs away. And you might ask, it would be a very good question to ask, what temperature do we have to get to before that runaway happens and it's too late to do anything at all? And the answer is, we have no idea. We have no idea. The whole area is much too complicated and different. There hasn't been enough studies done on it. The modeling can't really handle it. We just don't know. And these are some of the reasons. When I look at this, I say, we can't guarantee that we'll be safe at any temperature. But the more we hold it back, the better chance we give ourselves. Because if that permafrost goes into that runaway, there's so much carbon down there that will then go back into the atmosphere that there'll be nothing we can do. So this is why I changed what I was doing. This is why I stopped romping around the world just writing about interesting things and started saying we've got to do something about this. This gentleman is called Fatih Birol. He was chief economist of the International Energy Agency. He's just about to take over as head of the International Energy Agency. It's an agency that many say is in service of the energy industry. It's not necessarily one that's known to be particularly enlightened when it comes to environmental issues. And this is what he said. We are following a 6-degree trajectory every year in a very loyal way. Even school children know this will have catastrophic implications for all of us. So what he's saying is, if the plan were to warm the planet by 6 degrees, we could not be following it more faithfully every year, if that was the plan. Now, I pointed out that the temperatures that were on top of that graph I showed you before about when things get worse and worse and worse. Do you remember? Do you remember what they went up to? 5 degrees. In the worst nightmare of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that made that graph, they didn't even put 6 degrees on it. And that's where we're heading. And look at that. Even school children know this will have catastrophic implications for us. Some may say this is a cheap shot. School children may know it, but certain other people don't, right? I'm not going to say anything more about that. Actually, I will say one thing, which is, for your information, Senator, it's already with us. When I started in this game about 20 years ago, I was interested in climate change as a story, as a science, how it all fitted together, all the intricacies of it, and then I started learning more and more about it. And I've been trying to do something about it ever since. And about 20 years ago, scientists were saying, you know, it's going to be 30 or 40 years before we start to see the effects really, or maybe 20 years, or it's going to be a while, so we need to do something now, and it's going to be in the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the future is now here. So back to my favorite continent, Antarctica. I wanted to show you this because, can you see this in the background? It looks like they look like cliffs of ice. This is floating ice shelves. They used to be glaciers, and they floated off from the land onto the sea, and they're absolutely amazing. They're cliffs of ice. They can be thousands of feet tall, and they obviously go much deeper down below as well. So these are really, really thick, massive floating shells of ice. And they're melting. This is one particular shelf. It's a satellite image. This area is about the size of Rhode Island. I know that's a kind of classic measure here. It really is about the size of Rhode Island. This is what happened to it. And do you know how long it took to go from that to that? It took about 3 weeks. This happened a few years ago. And they've been going like dominoes. This shelf, another shelf, another shelf. Here, in my opinion, is more evidence that climate change is already with us. This is the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy in New York City. I went there and I did an event in the only hotel that stayed open in Lower Manhattan at the time. And I spoke to the manager who was there and I said, what was it like? What was it like? And she said, after a couple of days of darkness, my friend and I walked up 1.5 miles to 26th Street. And we bought a Coke and a burger. And we stood there in the light, and we ate the burger and we drank the Coke. And that direction was New York City. And that direction was apocalypse. It was a science fiction movie. It was Manhattan switched off and closed down. Now, you might say, and lots of people would say, it's one storm, big storms happen. They absolutely do. They really do. But something different's been happening lately. Look at this. This is Typhoon Haiyan. You remember it hitting the Philippines in 2013. That was the strongest tropical storm ever recorded in the Eastern Hemisphere, 2013. This is Patricia. Last year, the strongest tropical storm ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. This is Winston, this year. The strongest tropical storm ever recorded in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, it might be a coincidence, but I'm a scientist and I don't believe in coincidences. And then there's one more thing of the many things that I could point to, and that's migration. It's a hot topic right now. But a lot of the migration that's happening, a lot of the problems that have been happening in Syria and in Darfur and in Northern Africa started when there were unprecedented droughts. And that's when people started moving. And there's a lot of complex geopolitics that's gone on in all of these. It's not just one story. Remember I said at the beginning, the most important things happen in the areas where you can see the connections. So it's not just one thing, but it is a very significant player in all of this and having these people move. And there's a poet in London called Warsan Shire. Her parents were refugees, and she writes the most amazing poetry about it. And I wanted to read to you just one little section of a poem that she wrote. She'd written before this in the poem about what was happening in her home country, what was happening in her new country. She said, "Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap. I ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, 'Where does it hurt?' It answered, 'Everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.'" So that's where it's more or less at its bleakest. You can't look at any one of these events and say, that's because of global warming, that's because of global warming, that's because of global warming, because things happen. But what we are doing is we're putting our planet on steroids. You can see where I'm going here, can't you? These are the 7 times that he won the Tour de France. Can you point to which one of those, or which 2 of those, or which 3 of those were because of the steroids he was taking? You can't. But what you can say is it's changing the whole performance. And in the same way, we're putting our planet on steroids. And we got to stop. We really got to stop. So, thank you. So, what are we doing about it? Well, now I start to get to the good part. Because I've been saying this for quite a long time. Other scientists have been saying this for quite a long time. Greenpeace has been saying this for quite a long time. But just in the last year, year and a half, we've started to hear this from some very different voices. And that's one of the reasons I'm starting to feel optimistic and excited about what we're actually going to be able to do about this. And this is the first one I wanted to mention, because it really surprised me. This guy is the governor of the Bank of England. He's the chair of the Financial Stability Board. This guy could not be less Greenpeace. The challenges currently posed by climate change pale into significance compared with what might come. The more we invest with foresight, the less we regret with hindsight. He actually delivered this address to a bunch of insurance companies and then set it out into the world. We are facing serious financial risks from climate change, and we need to do something about it, is what he was saying. And here's another of my current heroes. Pope Francis speaking to the Congress last year. Take that, Jim, off. Now is the time for courageous actions and an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. So the Pope brought out this amazing encyclical, Laudato Si', all about climate change. It's an extraordinary document. And it talked not just about the science of climate change, but the moral implications. And this particular point about poverty, which is something that Chris said earlier, because one of the vilest things about climate change is it comes first and hardest for the poorest people, the people who have done least to cause it and who are least able to handle it. So this is a question not just of climate change, it's also a question of inequality, of poverty, of deprivation. You can't now solve one of those problems without solving all of them. Back to that point about integrated things. So that brings me to Paris. Now, I think we're going to have a chance to talk a little bit more about Paris when we have our discussion. But this is an event that took place in December last year, where 191 countries agreed unanimously on 30 pages of densely argued legal text. And to my mind, that's a miracle. I don't think you could get 191 countries to agree on where to go for dinner. So already, the result that came out of Paris was one that was extraordinary. Some years earlier, we were all very excited about it in 2009. We were supposed to get the agreement then in Copenhagen, and it went very, very horribly wrong. Some of the differences between what happened in Copenhagen and what went wrong, what happened in Paris and what went right, I think are quite interesting to know. And one of the biggest differences was the French diplomacy. Turns out they're brilliant at it. They arranged everyone had enough to eat, everyone had enough to drink, everyone had very pleasant surroundings. They sorted it out so that they kept people away from each other, then with each other, then away from each other when they were agreeing or disagreeing. They actually had some people that they sent in, very charming diplomatic French people, when things started to go wrong in any circumstance. They had this SWAT team. Do you know what they called them? They called them the Musketeers. So that was part of it. Another part of it was in Copenhagen. They sent all the heads of state in at the end. They were supposed to go in and say, right, you've got this agreement, we'll put our stamp on it. And by the time they arrived, all of the negotiations were in complete disarray. And so they had to try and salvage something that wasn't really anything at all. What they did in Paris was they had all the heads of state go there first. And there was almost a competition. Every single head of state got 3 minutes each to say their piece about climate change. It went on all day in 2 parallel sessions. And it almost became a competition. Who could say more? No, I think it's more important. No, I think it's more. So by the time they'd finished, it was really something. It was getting harder and harder for anyone to stand away from that. But I think what I might say is the biggest thing about Paris. Well, first of all, one other thing to mention is that the disappointing part is that every country in the end put in what was called an INDC, an intentional individual contribution to the overall reduction in emissions that we're going to need to be able to solve this problem. And if you add them all up, they don't come close. So in a way, what happened in Paris was all of the governments agreed. They all agreed to set a target of less than 2 degrees to try and get as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. It's a very bold target. It'll be very hard to achieve right now, although there are some possibilities for how to do it. But they also endorsed all of these individual contributions, which add up to about 3.7 degrees or more. So there's a big gap. And there's a credibility gap as well. But what I want to say about Paris, really, is that I think, apart from the fact that it's a miracle that they agreed, what we needed was a signal from the politicians to say, we're actually taking this seriously, and this actually matters to us. But there are other climate heroes who are coming in now, who I believe are the ones who are actually going to fix it. So here are some of the other things that came out of Paris. Completely separately from the government agreement, this thing was called Mission Innovation. It was announced there. 20 leading emitters, 20 different countries, all agreed that they were going to double the amount of investment they put into green technology. So as governments, we're going to double their investment in green technology. That's the Mission Innovation. Alongside a bunch of billionaires, not just these 4, but they were the most photogenic. Thank you for laughing. Came up with this thing called Breakthrough Energy Coalition. So the idea is the governments do the research, they put all the extra money into doing clean energy research, and then these guys figure out how to do the venture capital that can turn it from research into something that will actually go into business. So they're slightly unlikely climate heroes, but they're all in there. There are actually 20 of these mates of Bill Gates who are saying, we're going to put $1 billion in each to this fund, and we're going to make this thing happen. Does anyone know who this gentleman is? He's called Bertrand Piccard. He's the crazy guy that tried to fly a solar-powered plane around the world. And he's more or less making it, actually. He was brilliant in Paris because he came on with this helmet and this telephone. And he said, we're not still using telephone technology from 1920. So why are we still using energy technology from 1920? And I put him up there because he was there on a day that was called the Day of Action in Paris. Again, nothing to do with the political discussions, just the pressure that was coming from other players. And those other players were mayors, cities, states, regions, and businesses. So, what they all collectively were called, non-state actors, more than 70 cooperative initiatives, almost 11,000 total commitments, covering 1.25 billion inhabitants, 2,025 companies, 424 investors, 235 civil society organizations, and 1/3 of the 2,000 biggest global companies committed themselves to climate action. Did you know that? So this, my dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, is, I think, where the answer is going to lie. And this is also, I think, why we got the agreement in Paris in the first place. No government could afford to be the ones that were saying, I'm not going to agree, when there was all this pressure coming from all these players on the sidelines. You know who this is? So Mike Bloomberg has been an extraordinary player in the climate game. He was when he was mayor of New York. He's now taken on a task force. And the task force is there to try and figure out what investors need to know so that they can change the places that they invest. so that they can invest in the direction that we need to go to be able to tackle climate change, into green energy and into energy efficiency, and invest away from the polluters. So he set up this task force now. It's going to report at the end of this year. Do you know who this is? Someone does know. He's not a person I thought I'd be putting up in a talk like this as a climate hero. His name is Larry Fink. He's the CEO of BlackRock, which I believe is the company that has more assets under management than any other in the world. He wrote a letter to all 500 S&P companies' CEOs, and this is what he said. Today's culture of quarterly earnings hysteria, his word, not mine, is totally contrary to the long-term approach we need. Over the long term, environmental issues have real and quantifiable financial impacts, and you guys better do something about it. There was a lot more in the letter, but it was really amazing. Know who this is? Elon Musk. We are going to exit the fossil fuel era. It is inevitable, and this is one of the people who's making it inevitable. So not only does he have the fabulous Teslas, he's also now developing batteries, not just for individual homes, but also potentially for wider. Battery storage is going to be hugely important in this game. Because if you can make your energy anywhere, store it, and then carry it anywhere, then any investments in coal and oil and gas look much less secure. You won't know who this is. But the quote is so great, I had to put it in. This guy is called Steve Howard. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer of IKEA. And he said, enough with this stuff. We have now reached, he said, peak curtains. Peak curtains. But we can still grow, and we will do that sustainably. We'll be increasingly building a circular IKEA where you can repair and recycle products. Look out for this, the circular economy, where you don't just get something, consume it, and throw away, get something, consume it, and throw away, but you actually build circularity into the whole process. Anyone know who this is? You know who that is. All wearing the same blouse as well, look at that. I do have other clothes. This amazing lady is Lisa Jackson. She used to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency and did a very, very splendid job in that role. And now she's environmental director at Apple. And Apple have now got to a stage where 87% of their worldwide operations are fueled by green energy, by zero carbon energy. And they've done that by when the energy wasn't available, they've actually partnered with companies. They've helped build new solar plants to be able to do it. They're working hard on the final 13%, but they're also now talking to their supply chain to see if they can do the same there. They say it makes good business sense. This is what Lisa said. You do not have to choose between a clean and healthy environment and a thriving economy. In fact, everything about this moment tells me not just that you can have both, but you must have both. Anyone know who this is? This is Felipe Calderon, former president of Mexico. He's been recently making certain comments about a certain wall. I believe his theory is that it's fine to build the wall as long as it's on the 1847 boundary, in which case Santa Fe will be safely in Mexico. But he's in there as one of my climate heroes for a different reason, because he actually chaired an organization, a commission called the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. And they came to exactly the conclusion that Lisa Jackson just said. We can tackle climate change and at the same time get the economic growth we're looking for, and we need to do it right now. The conclusion of that report that Felipe Calderon chaired is that for the growth that we need, for the jobs that we need, for the economic development that we need to be able to lift people out of poverty, it's not anymore a story that either you can pay for that or you can pay for dealing with the environment. The evidence is overwhelming that you can't have one without the other. If you deal with the environment, you get the jobs. If you try to tackle the jobs without the environment, the economy tanks. So all of the evidence is there in some of these quite surprising climate heroes. This message has not necessarily been getting out, though. So this is a climate march that I went on. I have to confess that before this, I was a demonstration virgin. I'm not really much of an activist. I just try and do my thing from the sidelines, so I'd never been to one before. But I did go to this one. Can you see me? Go on. It's obvious. All right, I'll give you a clue. I'm not wearing this blouse, though. I put this up because I was quite surprised. At this point, the company that I work with now, I'm working with all these different businesses and finding again and again many more of these climate heroes, CEOs and senior executives of the companies that are saying, we're going to deal with this. And they want to do it because they want to do the right thing. And they want to do it because it makes economic sense. They want to be ahead of the game. They want to be the ones that win as the system inevitably changes. But look at this. Capitalism creates climate chaos. This is a story of us and them. And this is the headline in the Daily Beast the following day. Capitalism is saving the climate, you hippies. And in a way, they're sort of both right, and in a way, they're sort of both wrong. Because they're both right in that the way that we were doing capitalism was seriously broken. But I do think that we have a chance now to fix that with some of those climate heroes. This is an event that I put on last year. And let me just tell you who these people are. This guy here is a climate activist. At this time, he was 19. By the time he was 16, I believe, he'd sued the US government in every state in the US on behalf of his generation for their actions on climate change, or their inactions on climate change. This guy is Yves Dacour. He's the head of the International Red Cross Committee. This guy is Rick Haythornthwaite. He's the chairman of MasterCard, and he's the chairman of a big energy company called Centrica. This is me, wearing a different top. This is Malala Yousafzai. Amazing, amazing woman. Do you know, I sat myself between her and the rest. She was only 16 at the time. I sat myself between her and the rest because I wanted to protect her. Backbone of pure steel. But you know, all of them had different priorities, right? All of them are looking at different things. But in fact, it's the same story. And I'm trying to help them work together now. Because if we don't have businesses, and if we don't have activists, and if we don't have governments and policymakers, and if we don't have NGOs and humanitarian organizations all figuring this out together, we won't get the right answer. Pope Francis said something similar back at the Congress. And I wanted to read it out because I think it's beautiful. He said, "The challenges facing us today call for a renewal of that spirit of cooperation which has accomplished so much good throughout the history of the United States. The complexity, the gravity, and the urgency of these challenges demand that we pool our resources and talents and resolve to support one another." I wanted to say that because I'm getting really tired of whose fault is it. And it's you, and it's them, and it's him, and it's her, and it's it. And it's actually quite a comfortable thing to say, because if it's your fault, it's not mine. But I'm also very aware that every moment of my life has been privileged by the energy that's come from fossil fuels, from the first moment I took a breath in that first hospital. And all the way through, in the clothes that I'm wearing, the lights that we have today, the reason that you can hear my sound, how we got here, how we left, all of it has been based on this energy system that's really profited us. We're all in it together. We're all part of the problem, and we all need to be part of the solution. And the point now is, just like that telephone, it's out of date. It's time to change. We can talk about this a little bit more maybe when Chris and I come back on. But I've got one last thing I'd like to leave you with. Back to space. I promised we'd get back to space. And this is, obviously, the planet Saturn. Can you see what else there is in this picture? I'm not going to do a big blue arrow this time. You see that? I'll make it easier. That is the planet Earth, seen from Saturn. And the final thing I want to leave you with is a quote from the late, great Carl Sagan, which inspires me every time I need inspiring, which these days is more or less every day. You ready? Just look at that picture for a moment. Consider that pale blue dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Thank you very much.